Hello, I'm Gina Cacceci, webinar host for CenterWatch. Welcome to today's webinar on implementing remote monitoring, navigating technical and organizational obstacles. This webinar is brought to you by Agatha Incorporated. We're expecting the session to last about 45 minutes, followed by a live question and answer session. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please feel free to prepare questions for our presenter. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the formal presentation, and the questions will be addressed at the end. To ask a question, simply type your question in the area provided and press enter. Questions will not be viewable to other attendees. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker for today. Ken Lownie is the head of North American Operations for Agatha Life Sciences, a provider of clinical operations software. His goal is to help organizations implement easy-to-deploy solutions that empower business users to focus on their work, not the technology. Ken is a graduate of Colgate University and the Sloan School of Management at MIT and is a frequent speaker at industry conferences. We'll hand it over to Ken to get us started.
Thank you, Gina. I really appreciate it. This is Ken Lownie. I'm also joined on the phone by Barb, and Barb and I will take you through the next 40 minutes or so. My goal is to catch you up with some work, research, investigations that I've been doing for the last 6 months. During the COVID lockdown, some people learned to bake bread and some people learned new hobbies. I spent my time understanding remote monitoring and remote quality processes, the state of those things, where we are and where we're going. And my goal today is to share with you my COVID project. Hopefully it'll be informational and enlightening and perhaps even a little bit fun. Gina went through my introduction on the slide. It only adds that I'm up in New Hampshire. It's getting cool here. Winter is in fact coming. I live on a small farm with my wife Mary. And as it says, 6 goats, 3 pigs, and until yesterday it was 14 chickens. We had a little tragedy. There's a type of hawk called a Cooper's hawk, and once in a while a Cooper's hawk comes down and gets a chicken. So it's only 13 chickens now. Sorry about that. And to answer the usual questions, the chickens don't have names. We eat their eggs. The goats we don't milk. We're not going to eat them, and they just take up space and food. The 3 pigs, unfortunately, will have a very happy life and then one bad day. Those are the answers to your farming questions today. Hi, everybody. Let's get into it. I have 3 sections, very simple. The state of remote monitoring and associated quality processes. A look at the technologies, the solution requirements and alternatives. And lastly, some look at the organizational factors, the readiness for implementing these kind of solutions in your organizations. I apologize for the phone in the back. It'll be off in a second. Thus is the world of remote lock-ins, because I'm not in an office, obviously. It will be over in a second. Before I start, probably all 88 of you know what remote monitoring is. I just want to be very, very careful to say this is not about remote patient monitoring. This is not about attaching sensors and getting them. This is about the monitoring function that's done during clinical trials whereby a sponsor is responsible to ensure that the trial is adequately monitored, that they need to decide and have a plan for how they're going to ensure that the study objectives are met, the study protocols are followed, etc. That's what I'm talking about. We all know about monitoring. We all know it's about assuring that the people executing the clinical trial are qualified, that the protocol is being followed, that the source data is accurate and verified, etc. So that's what I'm focused on, though my scope also includes the associated quality monitoring processes. In other words, quality audits, clinical quality audits, follow-up on findings, etc. To me, these are very close cousins. These are 2 processes in the clinical operations world whereby people traditionally traveled to clinical sites, did an assessment or an inspection, and ensured that the quality of the clinical trial was high and that the rules were being followed. So I do think of both of them as two very close cousins, even though I tend to talk about remote monitoring. A lot of what I talk about today will be based on a survey that Agatha did. So we did a survey on the state of remote monitoring quality processes, and there's a white paper with the survey results, and it's meant to capture where are we today, where are people in terms of implementing remote monitoring, where are we in terms of plans to implement, etc. That white paper is available at the end of this session. I'll tell you how to get it, but a lot of the information you're going to see was drawn on that because, again, this was my project over the COVID shutdown period, and we had time, so we did a survey, we looked at the results, and we added it to the research we had done based on literature reviews. Oops. With that, I do want to start right away with some interaction and a poll question. This first poll question is just to get to know you so I can adjust my comments. It's meant to find out who's on and what type of organization. So this first poll is what type of an organization do you represent? You're going to click an answer and then submit. The types of organizations are sponsors, CROs, clinical sites, you all know what those are, and some others, probably some vendors, some consultants, etc. And I'll let that run for just another second. And it looks like overwhelmingly we have sponsors on today. We have some CROs and clinical sites. That's perfect. And with that, Gina, there it goes. I'm going to call it done, and we'll go ahead and publish that. And that's the answer we get. The majority are sponsors, 20% CROs, another 20% rounded off are sites, and 13% others. So I've got a mix. I think that leaves me presenting my slides as is. I won't skip anything. I'm going to go back to the slides and pick up from there and talk about the drivers for remote monitoring. I'm not going to belabor this because to me they're incredibly obvious. Before COVID, frankly, it was all about the cost. You could argue some quality as well. There's reasons why remote monitoring can actually increase quality, which we'll get into. But mostly it was about cost. This JAMA study, a little aged from 2018, looked at studies for a 2-year period previously, and that means that about 4 years ago, the median cost of a trial was $19 million, with some being as high as $345 million. That was based on 54 studies, clinical studies, that resulted in products gaining FDA approval. So those were successful, completed studies. And those are big numbers, obviously. The median tells you that there's lots of smaller ones, but the big ones are very expensive. But here's the real point. It's not how much the studies were. It's what percent was travel. So monitoring tended to be, it's a different study, but looking at the same type of data, 25 to 30% of the overall cost of clinical trials. And most of that monitoring cost, not all, but most of it, frankly, is travel. Because you all know the model. During a clinical study, we take a couple of people or one person and we send them to the site and they stay for a couple of 3 days and they stay at hotels and they have to eat food, and they have to have airfare, and it's very expensive. So the travel portion of traditional monitoring and quality inspections is really enormously high. And when you're looking at trends and what's going to happen in the future, as they say, follow the money. It's very clear that people are going to drive to lower costs. They need to drive to lower costs. That's what capitalism does. And if anything, COVID accentuates that because it's showing people how much they can save. So I think the changes that we're seeing, increased remote monitoring, are here to stay. I think it's only going to accelerate. Now you add COVID to it. So it's not an opportunity created by COVID, it's an opportunity accelerated. For more than 10 years, folks have been talking about remote monitoring and virtual trials. So these things have been the subject of lots of talk, but much less reality, because there's a bunch of obstacles we're going to talk to in a minute. But the COVID crisis obviously made this an imperative because people simply couldn't, and to some degree still cannot travel. and therefore studies were shut down, studies were interrupted, studies were slowed down. So the need for remote mechanisms to keep studies going is overwhelming. We had the traditional issues around cost, and now we have a crisis that accelerated them. So I want to now see where you are. This is the second of 3 polls, where you are in terms of your use of remote monitoring. So we're going to do another quick poll and ask Gina to turn that on. And we're going to look at what your organization's posture is in terms of current uses of remote monitoring, et cetera. It's the same process before. This is poll number 2. Click on it. Be sure to hit submit. Sorry for the wordiness. So the first choice is you're already using them to some degree. Wow, a lot of people there. Getting close to using them, 21%. So together, that's 80% of people. Others in the research phase trying to figure it out, 13%. And some people who are either not applicable or not sure it's going to make sense for them. So I'm staggered by these results because they're an increase of where we were. 56 plus 24%, that's still 80% of you are either already using to some extent or getting close to using. That's a huge move from the time of our survey. Let's go ahead and stop that, publish those results, and freeze it. And now let me show you on my slides what the survey responded with previously. So in the survey we did, which wasn't that long ago, it was lower numbers. It was 32% using to some degree, significant degree, 45% using it to a degree. So that's 4, 5, 6, 7. You know what? It's not as different as I thought. I have to be honest and not try to cover up my confusion. 45 plus 32 is 77%, so it's not that different. You know what's different is the larger number already using. So there is an acceleration. I will grab credit for being accurate about that, but this overall number is similar. Very interesting. Let's go on from there and say, well, why not for those who aren't, for those who are partial, who aren't there all the way? And I think there's 4 obstacles. I have 3 listed here. There's economic, there's regulatory, and behavioral. On the economic side, there's a cost, of course, but there's also confusion around cost. Who should pay for the software and systems required for remote monitoring? Should the sites pay? Should the CRO pay? Charge the sponsor? Should the sponsor be dictating it? There's a question in the industry because many sites want to move to remote monitoring. They're willing to do the work, but it's not clear at all to them that they have the right to do so because sponsors and CROs decide systems that are going to be used in studies. So there's economic confusion. There's regulatory uncertainty. As always in our industry, the FDA gives guidance, but the FDA doesn't always give clarity. So there's a hesitation, especially around things like patient data. And then there's behavioral obstacles, organizational obstacles that site teams who are used to working in certain ways, perhaps with paper binders, et cetera, may be resistant to change. Now, I said 4 because there's also technological, or technology, I should say, barriers to moving forward. So there's these 4 areas, and different people, different respondents to our survey responded different ways. I do want to take on the FDA part because the FDA regulatory environment or regulatory guidance on remote monitoring is pretty clear. This is traditional about monitoring. This isn't about COVID. That they updated their approach, their guidance for monitoring over the years to use a risk-based approach that, for instance, 100% source data verification is not needed. They're very clear on this. And that whatever you do, you have to document it. You need a documented plan for how you're going to monitor and manage quality, including naming the tools, naming the processes, naming the schedule. So that's what the FDA has always said. Now, what did they say in COVID? This is getting back a ways to March, but this is direct from FDA guidance. If planned on-site monitoring visits are no longer possible, sponsors should consider optimizing the use of central and remote monitoring programs to maintain oversight. So we should take the regulatory off the table. that shouldn't be an obstacle. I've spoken directly to FDA people, and they're very clear that they're supportive of this. And they have been for some time. They have a designated evangelist, in fact, for it. So that was one of the obstacles. Now let's talk about the other obstacles, and this is the third and last poll. I want to get from you what you see as the obstacles, and then we'll compare it to the bigger survey result. So Gina, if you would switch over to that poll, and let's look at it. This is poll number 3. And Gina will open it up. And the question is, what do you think is the biggest obstacle, the single biggest obstacle to implementing remote monitoring? One is the lack of technologies that solve it well. One is regulatory, despite what I just said. One is economic barriers and challenges. And the last is organizational and behavioral. So a nice spread of answers here. I'll let it go for another moment. But roughly speaking, a third of people think it's about technology. More than that, almost half think it's organizational. And then we kind of split it between regulatory and economic. So mostly it's not about the FDA. Mostly it's not about money. Mostly it's we don't have great solutions, and it's going to be hard to get organizations to adopt this. Let's freeze that there and notice that the largest is organizational. Second largest is technology. And now let's look at what the study said when we did it. I have that here. A little different. This group in the survey, which interestingly was more split to include more sites, was technical was first. Technical was 41%, whereas you guys said organizational was first. And organizational was actually third. Behavioral organizational was third. This organization said regulatory was second, and you guys rated that much lower. And I think that's because time has passed since we did the survey. But technology still looms large. This group said 51%. You folks rated it second to organizational. I will say this, you're a smart audience, because I think organizational factors are always underrated and always a huge challenge, especially when we're dealing with sites. So I respect this audience very, very much. All 124 of you now connected, I see. So that whole section was about the drivers, where we are in the state of remote monitoring. And what's our takeaway? It was always emerging as a new alternative to do this remotely. COVID accelerated the move to remote monitoring. More people are doing it than you think. It's getting highly adopted now. And the barriers are perceived as mostly behavioral and technology. Those are kind of the takeaways from our first section together. Now let's talk about the technologies. Our third section will be on organizational, but let's talk technology for a minute. And I'm almost going to change personas, and I'm going to become a software guy, which is what I am at heart. So when we build software, we think about what the software has to do, and then we have methodologies for collecting those requirements. I'm going to take you through a little bit of that. First, I'm going to preview what I'll call the big requirements for a technology solution for remote monitoring and quality. Obviously, it has to be compliant. So we need to deal with 21 CFR Part 11 in the states. We need to deal with other health authorities. We need to deal with HIPAA. It needs to be easy to use because these are site staff. These are not sponsor staff. They're not CRO staff. These are not necessarily highly automation-friendly people. So site staff need to be able to use it easily and quickly. And we're going to spend time on that in a minute. We need to deal with the security. Sites worry tremendously about their responsibility for data. So they have to be very comfortable that the content is truly secure. They're not breaking any rules by putting it in the cloud. In the cloud is a scary thing for some people. And we need really good integration because it's not necessarily true that all sites, all CROs, and all sponsors are going to have the same solution. So we need to be able to move documents around from system to system, for instance, from a local repository to the trial master file. And we need the right technologies to make that easy to do and easy to integrate. So if you and I sat down and had a little working session for an hour, that's what we'd come up with. We'd say, that's what we need. But we in the software industry have a methodology called user stories. and I'm going to take you through the 6 user stories that we built as a software company for what the system needs to do. User stories are just a methodology instead of really deep functional requirements like you folks like to give us in RFPs. User stories are short, simple descriptions of a feature. And they're always in this format. As a blank, as a monitor, I need or want to blank so that I can do blank. That's the format. It is ironclad. You may not change the format. It's got 3 blanks to fill in. And that's how we build software these days from a product requirements perspective. So I'm going to go through the 6 or 7 that we used for our remote monitoring solution and see if you agree. These will go very fast. As a monitor, so I'm the person from a sponsor or CRO, what do I need to do? I want to be able to specify the documents I expect a site to provide. Although there's a reference model for the investigator site file, of course, sponsors and CROs modify off the reference model. So they have specific documents that they expect to see. Everybody expects to see informed consent and 1572s, but other people have other documents that they use, and some in the reference model they don't use. So I need to specify the documents I expect the site to provide so that they understand what they have to provide to me, that they understand the requirements. That's number 1. Think of it as a blank binder file. Now, go back to the other side. Now I'm on a site. As a site administrator, I need to be able to load documents easily into the application. This can't be hard to do. This can't be functionality a la OpenText or Documentum or FileNet or Viva from the last 10 years, where people have many steps with workflows to load documents. That's not going to work at the site level. Sites need the equivalent of drag and drop capabilities so that they can do it quickly, they don't have a big learning curve, and they're not going to waste time and become frustrated. So the software we use at sponsors and CROs can't just be said, hey, use this at the site. I'm here to tell you that's not going to work. There are many things I've learned in 30 years in the software industry, and that's not going to work for sure. What else? As a site administrator, number 3, I need to be sure that the documents I load are secure so that only appropriate people can see them. I need to be really comfortable as a site administrator, a site manager, a site leader, that where I put these documents is okay, that I'm not breaking any rules, not breaking any laws. I worry about this a lot as a site. Number 4, back to the monitor side. Once there's files in a repository, as a monitor, I want to be able to access those essential documents. I want to be able to view them, and I want to be able to comment on them, but I can't change them. These are not mine. These are the site's files. I can't change them. So as a monitor, I want to view them, and I do want to provide comments on them just as I would as a monitor. Monitors love yellow stickies. So as a monitor, even though I'm working digitally, I want to put yellow stickies on things and say missing signature, check the date, whatever else I would say as a monitor. And I need to do that so I can confirm they're complete and accurate. That's my job as a monitor. Also, as a monitor, I want to be able to document some activities that don't relate to the documents per se. Here's what I mean. It's not just review document. It's also look at processes and say, hey, you're doing this in a suboptimal way. Just as I would on site, I want to be able to give notes to the site staff that says, I'd like to see this process changed. So not everything is about documents, and I need to do that so I can share my observations on other issues. That's number 5 for a monitor. Number 6, back to the administrator side. Now I'm back at the site side. I want to be able to react to those comments and notes. The monitor left me yellow stickies. I want to be able to address those issues, and I want to be able to communicate back to the monitor that I've done that. Yep, thank you for your note. I took care of it. So there's a collaborative feature with this system that needs to say the monitor has an observation, the administrator responds to it, just as they would if they were in real life. And as a monitor, I want to be able to see what's missing. I want to be able to check at any time and say, what's still missing from this investigator site file from site X? And I want to do that so I can assess the state of the project at any point and say, wait, we're still missing 4 documents. And as a monitor, I want to be able to move items. So this is an interesting thing that a digital solution gives us that we can't do on site. I'm monitoring, I'm looking at a document, and I'm deciding this is complete. I can and should and want to move it to the study trial master file. I can't change it, but I can move it. And that allows me to save the time and effort of other processes, such as faxing it, sending it, moving it from email out. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I can select some documents and say move to the TMF? And that was in our own requirements, user stories. And here's the final and most interesting one of all. As a monitor, what do I do about patient records? So as a monitor, how do I do source data verification, for instance? How do I handle source files and patient records? One is access another system directly, go into the patient record system, and that's done, especially by larger organizations today. But it's complex. You need to securely give access to the monitor to another system. If IT is involved, sorry if you're on the phone, IT, but if IT is involved, that's going to take a couple of weeks to go through the form filling, to give access through a VPN to get to the patient record system. So it can be hard. Or I can pull them out of a patient system and then load them into this separate ISF system. So there's a couple of ways to do this. Then there's a question of, do they need to be redacted? Can they be redacted? So we have different approaches we've taken to this because the state of the industry varies. But it's clearly impractical to always expect monitors and quality personnel to be able to access patient records electronically directly in a system. That is not a universally available solution at all. So we need other ways to do that. And that was a big question as we went through our own design work. So that's what we put together as our own list for building a piece of software. And I thought I'd share it with you because whatever you use, and of course other vendors have other solutions, those are good things to look at. How does my solution do user case 3, user story 4? It's an interesting way to look at software.
Hi,
what I will tell you is, please go ahead, Barb.
Sorry, can you just do covers the user story 4 again? Someone just missed it and they were just looking to hear you explain that quickly again.
Thank you very much. Great interruption. I appreciate it very much too. The user story 4 was as a monitor. So I'll go slowly and say I'm a sponsor doing direct monitoring, not using a CRO. And as that assigned monitor, I want to be able to see the binder files, the ISF files. I want to be able to see those essential documents. Let's take a 1572. I want to be able to view them. There it is. Looks complete, it's fine. But maybe there's one that has a deficiency. So I want to be able to comment on them. This is where I was saying that I want to be able to perhaps put a yellow sticky on one. And I mean that metaphorically, of course. I want to put a sticky note and say there's a problem with this document, just as I would if I was on site. And I do that because my job is to confirm that the essential file set is complete and that they're accurate. So that was user story number 4. And as I was starting to say, that was the set of user stories. And in case you're worried that this is a commercial advertisement for our solution, I want to assure you it's not. And the way I'm going to do that is just show you the exact technology that allows you to do this. This is the, I don't know how to describe it, but the conceptual diagram of how a system like this works. So bear with me as I take you through it. If you're on the phone right now listening in and you're a sponsor, then you know what a study trial master file is, or TMF file. So a sponsor has access to their own TMF file. They're looking at it all the time, adding documents to it. We all know how that works. So what do sites do? One idea to tell you what we didn't do, and I don't think it's right, hey, the site can just put stuff in the TMF. The site could have access to our TMF. Technologically, that's completely possible. But what we learned is sites are very uncomfortable with putting their document in some place that they don't control. So what we need, if this is one repository, and let's just for argument's sake say it's in the cloud, we need each site to have its own ISF file, its own binder file in the cloud. So site 1 has site file 1, site 2, site 3 has its own file. And the monitor is the only other person other than site personnel who can look at those files. This was user story number 4. The monitor has a perspective that says, I can go in through the left-hand side and look at the essential documents. Look at it, look at it, look at it. Make a note here, make a note there, make a note on a process there. Now I'm going to go to site file number 2. But notice the only people who can see site file 1 are site 1 personnel and the monitor. Because those are the rules, right? Monitors don't change stuff in a site's own binder file. Monitors look and comment. So the monitor's going in, the monitor's going in, the monitor's going in and monitoring. And that's how it works. So we have these multiple spaces that frankly all look quite the same because the trial master file and the investigator site file are subcomponents of each other. But we add some things. What can the monitor do? He can review or she can comment. She can make a note. She can assign an action item, says, hey, site administrator, I need you to do this. And then this magic I mentioned, they could move something. They can go to site file 1, take a 1572 that is complete and say, click, move it to the TMF. And it moves through the monitor's control to the TMF. And that's a way to build this solution. This is actually my slide from when we were building our solution. And I was telling the technologists what I need. So I'm sharing a lot here, kind of inside story of how software is built, because my main message is the technology for remote monitoring is not an obstacle. It's not rocket science. This is a solved problem. We have the cloud. We have controlled access. We have everything we need to do this. We have compliance systems. What are people doing today? Pardon me. They're doing the same thing that I'm showing here with site file 1, but they're doing it with things like Dropbox. And that's not cool. That's not cool, folks, because it is not compliant. It's not necessarily signed documents, version controlled, et cetera. That 21 CFR part 11 says they should be. So that's not cool. You do need these repositories, but you do need them to be compliant. So that's where the technology is.
You want to do a couple questions before you move on?
I was just going to ask you that question, young Barb. That would be great.
To cut in. So Michael asks about data redaction and why does the data need to be redacted? You didn't really mention that, so I was just kind of thought you could address that.
So this is one of those disclaimers that people who aren't lawyers make. I am not an authority. You can't quote me and say, but Ken said. But my impression is that Michael's question is spot on. You don't need to redact. This is information that's in a clinical trial that people have agreed to the clinical trial, and the information is being shared appropriately from site to sponsor. So I don't believe there is any need for redaction, but I've been asked the question many times. And some software provides the ability to redact patient name, et cetera, in this data set. Now, some of you on the phone know more about this than I do. So there you have it. That's what I know, which is I don't understand why redaction is necessary, but I've been asked the question, and some solutions do provide the redaction capability. I don't work on the data side of clinical trials. I'm a clinical ops person who understands these kind of processes, but not the data side. So I just don't get why that would be. Not a great answer, Michael, and we can follow it up on a one-on-one at some point. Maybe you know more than I do. Did you have another question, Barb?
I do. Do the solutions available include the ability to extract patient records and move them directly into the ISF?
So this is a conceptual vision that I want to draw for you. Wouldn't it be cool if I'm in a system that is an investigator site file, and I could click a button that says, go to the patient record system and get the following records and pull them in? Wouldn't that be cool? And my answer from a technology perspective is yes, that would be cool. It would be very cool to click a button and say, add the following to my investigator site file. These items are over in the patient record system. Is it possible? It's completely possible. Are we doing it in our solution? No, we're not. And the question is, if it's interesting and cool and you can do it, why aren't we doing it? And the answer is we haven't been asked too much. And it's a level of complexity because of the uniqueness of different patient record systems. So it's on our list to keep thinking about, and we could go with the largest 3 or 4 patient record systems and build that in. We also feel it will get into complexity because these are sites, they don't have IT departments. Some don't, I'm sorry, of course hospitals do, but you know what I mean. Not everyone has an IT department, and it does introduce complexity, and our own focus as a software company is very, very fast, simple implementations to decomplexify this type of software. So we haven't done it yet, but it's certainly possible. And I think it's part of the solution, yes, absolutely. What we're doing right now is people simply extract the files they want, download them and drag and drop them, which isn't perfect because there's some exposure when those patient records are in between states. They're not in the patient record system and they're not in our system. And that's always a bad idea because it means there's some local copies, or there shouldn't be, and you can cover it with protocols. But we're not happy with it. So that's where we are with our solution. I hope that helps answer the question, and I hope you appreciate the transparency of how we're thinking about these things. Any others, Barb?
I've got one more before you move on that fits
Okay.
into this section. Could this process be adopted to do remote quality assurance by a compliance office within an organization? So not by a sponsor, but perhaps by an HRPP?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate it. We've worked with some organizations that are SROs. Is that the right term? Someone on the phone knows what I mean. Clinical trial organizations that own many sites. Remember the acronym, CROs, SROs. And let's go with SRO, even if I'm wrong, you can laugh at me privately. But there's organizations that own or manage a whole bunch of sites. And those sites want to do internal quality work that is below the level of an audit. And the answer is yes, absolutely. The software does the same thing. There's a really interesting question, Barb, which is, if you're doing an internal quality audit, let's say a hospital is doing an internal quality review, before a monitoring, before a formal quality inspection, do those records get preserved? And the answer is no, we don't want findings. No. The whole idea is to avoid findings. So there's some interesting things about the software and what you do and what you retain, what's legal. And I guess the question is, if internally a reviewer corrects a document, did that ever happen? If internally a quality person says, these aren't ready yet, they're not ready to go final, did that ever happen? Does it have to be recorded and a version saved? The answer appears to be no, but you can see the interesting things we get into. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so if someone from the FDA is on the phone and wants to immediately respond and say, what are you talking about, Ken? That would be fine. But people really do want to do quality assessments internally because the whole point is not to have quality issues. So not everything should be surfaced to the level of a finding. Great questions. I really appreciate them, both from you, Barb, and from the people who submitted them. We're in the third section, less than 5 minutes, so we're good on time. Keep the questions coming. I absolutely love them. I wanted to turn from the technology to the organizational side. You folks on this call said this was the biggest issue, and I think you're very smart, as I said, to think that. So let's talk about it. I'm not going to do too much, but in my own research, my own learning about this area in the last 6 or 8 months, the site burden, site burden came up again and again and again. It wasn't a term I had heard before, but frankly, to be honest, in my career, I've been all focused on sponsors and CROs, not sites. So I haven't lived the life of site people. I haven't spent time on sites to understand their world, but I have learned how easy it is to say, oh, the sites can do this, the sites can do that, and create a burden that's unmanageable for the sites. Because the sites are the tip of the tail being wagged by the dog, from what I can tell. So I found this perfect picture, I felt, a huge burden on a female, and on not being sexist, quite the opposite, that I find the clinical operations world is populated by extraordinarily capable women, often women, obviously, not exclusively, who have tremendous expectations and burdens put on them. It's kind of like what we do to moms, and they expect too much from the, you take care of soccer practice, this, and this, and by the way, you have a full-time job, but I, the male, I'm just going to do my job. Sorry, I'm a little, I'm liberal in my view of male-female politics. So we do put a big burden on site administrators, and the picture captures that. And what do I mean? What I mean that is sponsors and CROs and software vendors, the site perspective is critical. We can't think of sites as just, a smaller version of sponsors and CROs. We have different language. Sponsors talk about the TMF. My first 10 conversations with sites were like, why do you keep talking about the TMF? We use the binder file. We use eRegs. We eDocs. And for us, it's the investigator site file, which is of course part of the TMF, but it's a small subset. Sponsors have the perspective of one study going across many sites. So sponsors are thinking one way, kind of horizontally. Sites are dealing with multiple studies with different processes and systems. A single site might be dealing with many studies with different CROs and different sponsors with different requirements and different processes and systems. So complexity created by multiplicity of processes and systems is a big problem at the site level. Sponsors have lots of money. I know most of you on the phone are sponsors and you may disagree, but in the relative world, you guys have a lot of money to solve problems. Sites never have enough money. The economics are just fundamentally different. Sponsors tend to be, I'm saying big businesses, even if you're a 200-person biotech, you're a big company compared to a clinical office with 15 staff members. Sites are sometimes very small operations. And sponsors care extraordinarily about the data. They care about the study and the data and the results and the accuracy. Sites have this funny thing, they have patients. So sites have to care first and foremost about patients. That's what they do all day. There's a patient waiting in a clinical examination room, and that's first and foremost. What they do for clinical studies is in addition to their day job. So site burden is a real issue. We have to be really thoughtful about it with these systems. We have to make them easy to use. We can't think of them as para-professional computer users. These are people with a day job. So how have I addressed this? This is in some of my own work, working with my own customers and assessing readiness for remote monitoring and remote quality. And I call it assessing the fit, or fit and readiness. So these are the kind of questions that I go through in a workshop. We're talking about a study X. Well, how many sites are involved? Is it 3 or 300 or 3,000? Have the site and sponsor and CRO worked together before? So if it's a small study with 5 sites, are they well known to all the players? Are they on a first name basis? They've done many studies before. A great thing. Or are they completely new? We have no idea. Are the sites hospitals? Are they doctors' practices? Are they storefront operations? Are they a combination? A huge factor in determining how to move into the remote world. What are the site's current practices? Are they paper-based? What's their patient record system? Or studies, what have they used? What's the relationship with the sites? Are they really friendly? The same group of people working through a series of related studies. You know, it's a dermatological practice. It's a dermatological company. And they've done a bunch of things together. That's a really nice relationship, and we can probably ask them to do more versus a completely anonymous relationship. What's the current practices with records? What's the administrative model? Is there a separate CRA organization? How many are there? So what's their administrative model? And what systems are they already using at the sponsor and CRO? If the sponsor and CRO are Viva users, how does that impact the site? Are we going to ask them to use the Viva site solution? So it's those kind of questions that I go through in workshop mode, try to score them in terms of what makes a clinical study really likely to be successful or unlikely to be successful. And then I score it this way. The fit of the study from low to high. Is this study a good fit for remote monitoring? And the fit of the site. Is this site or this set of sites a good fit? Because I want to move into new studies using remote monitoring in this target space. The study's a good fit, and the site or sites that we're targeting are good fit. This is going to vastly improve the success versus sort of a, don't even ask the questions, just dictate and say, this is the new system, you've got to use it. And that's pretty much all I'm going to share on the organizational side, because not that it's private, I would have a conversation with any of you on the phone, and I would invest an hour going through this methodology. I'd be happy to. It's not private. It's just a whole nother web broadcast on looking at the behavioral side. And I have done this, and we have used it, and we have very successful launches of new studies using remote monitoring, including for COVID, which has been very exciting and gratifying to me. So a little bit short treatment of this subject, but feel free to come back for more. I'm happy to talk about it some more. We did create a model, a methodology based on software agile methodology principles of how to move into remote monitoring. And one is to look at the user stories I mentioned, look at the scoring I just showed, and then do an internal trial quickly of the software. Choose the right study and the right sites and the right solution. So you do an internal trial, test it internally, choose a study that's just right, avoid complexity and strangers, I mentioned, and then iterate it. So this is about a sprint-based iterative model. And without naming the name, there's an organization in Scotland, a small sponsor that I've done this with just recently, and it was really, really successful. We talked a lot. We did an internal trial, got them very comfortable. They chose a study with just 3 sites. We trained the sites, and it was very successful. And now they're iterating and expanding the number of sites, et cetera. So this is sort of a launch model. And again, I can share more on this. This is sort of just a high-level taste. As you might guess, Agatha has solutions in this space. Agatha is a clinical operations software company. We set out 5 years ago to disrupt this space, meaning we are anti-platform, we're anti-Documentum, anti-open text FileNet. We believe that this class of software is overdue for modernization, for easy-to-use, downloadable apps that you can use very, very quickly. We try to get our customers going from, yes, I want the solution, to using it in a matter of weeks, not a matter of months or a year to deploy a trial master file. We have a solution for trial master file and a solution for remote monitoring that we call Agatha Remote ISF. That's the commercial part of our presentation. The remote monitoring solution is just what I was sharing with you. It's based on those user studies, et cetera. And that's it, Barb. I want to move to questions and discussion. I want Gina to give a quick refresher, but hold just 1 second, Gina. Because some people will drop off during questions, I wanted you to know that you can get 2 white papers from me. One I mentioned earlier, it's the state of remote monitoring and quality processes in clinical studies, survey results. So that's one white paper. And we've had a white paper out for the last few months, and it's called Implementing Remote Monitoring and Quality Management, a Technology Guide. This is the long version of some of those user stories that I went through and our methodology for deploying it. So 2 white papers. You can get either one by just emailing me. My email address is ken.lowney@agathalife.com. You can also go to agathalife.com. The technology guide's available now as a download. The survey results is not yet available as a download off the site. So in that case, if you're looking for the survey results, send me an email. The reason you might want the survey results is just to benchmark yourself. Where do you stand versus the industry? And that's what it was designed for, is really a benchmarking study. And now I'm going to go back, as people inevitably will leave, but those who have questions, go ahead. Gina, did you want to refresh the instructions for how to submit questions?
Yes, Ken. So, ladies and gentlemen, now is your chance to have your questions answered. Remember, this portion of the conference is also being recorded. And to ask a question, you can use the question and answer panel on your screen, type your question into the area provided, and just press enter. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the remaining time.
And Barb, are you monitoring any of these questions?
I am, and we covered some of them, but here's a couple of more. Kristen wanted to know if you can speak to the regulatory considerations for the EU. It's obviously it's a challenge with the GDPR and everything.
Barb, I made a mistake. I apologize. I was reading a question while you were saying that question. It was a really interesting question. In my own defense, Dawn Bollinger, I'm sorry, Dawn, I shouldn't use her last name, Dawn, had a really interesting question that I was reading. But you go ahead, Barb. Can you repeat that question for me?
Yeah, sure. Kristen wants to know if you can speak to the regulatory considerations for the EU.
Not very well, Kristen. I apologize. Being a traditional ethnocentric American, I spent most of my focus on 21 CFR Part 11 and the FDA. We all know that the health authorities in the EU are very, very similar in what they require, but I would be being irresponsible if I told you I had done much on the rules around remote monitoring, the capabilities to use these technologies in EU. What I can tell you, actually, now that I think of it, is that we have customers, several, in the EU, as I mentioned, in Scotland for one, who are using these with no hesitation at all. But we didn't do that research. I should do that research. And if I do, I will keep these questions and update you. Sorry about that, Chris.
Okay, here's another one for you from Jessica. What portion, if not all, of remote monitoring practices will translate to sponsor GCP compliance audits? So is there an expectation, she asks, that remote monitoring tools can also be used for GCP study audits?
So thanks for the question. The question is the extensibility of what I've gone through here to GCP quality audits. And for me, it's 100%. This was an education for me when I really dug in on monitoring and thought about the difference between monitoring and quality audits. And some of you, again, are smarter than me about this, but from my perspective, it's a level of formality and some of the methodology, but the process is identical, and we built our app to do both. So you can also do this under the umbrella of an audit with findings and do it remotely. Now, I think the future, probably somebody asked this question, I haven't gone through them, the future is going to be a hybrid model. But there's not everything we can do remotely. We can't go look at locks on doors remotely. We can have them take pictures of locks on doors. So there's a lot you can do. But I think the reality is that these technologies for both GCP quality audits and for remote monitoring are going to be hugely used, but not replace 100% on-site visits. I think in a bizarre way, people like to travel, and there's reasons that on-site can do things that off-site can't. So I think we'll be in a hybrid model. The percentage breakdown, I don't know. Feels like 80-20 will be remote, 20% will be on-site, but I'm not sure. We'll take a couple more, Barb?
Yeah, actually, you were already reading, Dawn, so I'm going to let you go with that one. And there's kind of a follow-up I have that's kind of in line with what she's talking about.
So thank you for your question, Dawn. I was reading it because it's interesting and long. And the first part, the core part, is about wet signatures. So this hybrid model of we want to electronically sign, a site requires wet signatures, that's their local protocol, you might say, creates a complexity. Of course, wet documents, that's not the right term, documents with wet signatures can be scanned and added, and then if another signature is needed, it can be electronically signed on top of it. So there's process solutions here. And I'm probably being now a sponsor-centric person, but can't we get the site to change their protocol? Since electronic signatures are acceptable regulatorily, can't we work on that problem as part of getting a remote monitoring or quality system in place with sites? So I'm probably being simplistic, Dawn. Your question also goes on to talk about patient files. I'm not going to address that right here, especially because you mentioned the specific system you use, which is the biggest patient record system. But again, I'd be happy to afterwards. Or you know what I'll do? We have, from what I can tell, 22 questions. And for those I don't answer here, I will jot answers in email and send them to you folks. So thank you, Don, for that question.
Okay, here's another one from Austin. How big of a problem do you think it is for study IRBs to get the evidence needed that the software being used adequately safeguards patient privacy and security?
You know, it's a really interesting question. So for institutional review boards whose job is to protect various parts of the study, but especially patient rights, I mean, that's their job, to say this is okay. As a technologist, I know it's not only okay, it's better. We can protect patient privacy much better this way than with others. But I do acknowledge that IRBs are not of one type. There's all kinds of IRBs, and some could be tremendously conservative, some could be quite ignorant of technologies. So once again, I don't have a great answer. I haven't run into the problem, I can say that. I haven't run into the problem at all with our customers. But I acknowledge that there is a discussion there, that study startup, when you develop the plan, that this is how we're protecting patient records. But the idea that, well, it's in the cloud, therefore it's dangerous, it doesn't hold true. It's not, it's I almost said fake news. You probably all kill me for that. It's just not true. We can protect things very, very well. And again, better than if they're in paper files within a site. So hopefully it's not an issue. I haven't seen it to be an issue, but I acknowledge that there's a pause there depending on individual IRBs. I'm giving lots of nuanced, equivocal answers, Barb. I need to give a yes or a no here somewhere. Give me an easy one.
Well, I'm not sure this one is easy for you either. This is from Leanne. As a sponsor, she says, my thought is that the gateway to remote monitoring must be access to the ICF. Do you agree that it's important that the number one document to be reviewed as part is the SDV, and any ideas or best practices to help sites embrace and share this so that the SDV can proceed?
Yeah, I'm gonna fulfill what I just said. I think she's right. I lost the questioner's first name, but I believe that's correct, and I think that's a great way to initiate and proceed because it is the root of the startup process with the site. So that makes perfect sense to me. I'd have to check with my own customers who have implemented in the last 6 months whether they've taken that approach, but if they haven't, I'll be bringing it up with them as a really good test case to get started. So lots of words, but my answer is yes, I agree, Barb.
Okay, so here's one more question for you. Yeah, last question. So you talked about how after, COVID, after we hopefully get through COVID sooner rather than later, we'll kind of revert to a hybrid model of remote monitoring plus an on-site. How would the technology work then? Would the people who were on site use the same remote monitoring technology? Like, how would it all work together?
Well, that's interesting. I haven't thought about it, but the answer is yes. That all I see is that, hopefully I'm not being too simplistic here, but all I see is that we have a study, it's going on. We've been using a remote monitoring solution like I described in that set of graphics. All the documents are updated. And now, let's say at a 6-month anniversary or later, we are going to do an on-site visit. And that on-site visit results in additional information. If it's an audit, additional findings. And those things are going to be put in the exact same system. It's not going to change the tool set. It's just going to add the layer of face-to-face contact and face-to-face discussion. Our application does have a place for those notes and meeting notes for those things that happen face-to-face. So I don't see any complexity process-wise in combining the two. I certainly would be against the idea of, well, we use this application, this system for remote activities, then we're on site, we switch it up and we do this different thing. I would be very against that. It would be hard to document and would increase the tendency to make mistakes and have process errors. So I think that's a bad idea. And I don't think the person is suggesting that. My answer is use the same system. Sometimes you use that system even while you're sitting across from someone in an on-site model. Okay, Barb?
Yep, that's all from here.
Wow, what a great session. Many of you hung on, most of you hung on, the majority. Thank you all for joining. Gina, I'm going to turn it back to you for a second to do our sign off. Thank you, Gina, very much for acting as producer. Thank you, Barb, very much for monitoring. questions and helping me through this. Go ahead, Gina.
Well, thank you both very much for a great presentation, very informative. On behalf of CenterWatch and Agatha, I would like to thank our participants for joining us today. Please be sure to fill out the survey at the conclusion of the webinar. Your feedback is very important to us. This now concludes the webinar. Have a great day, and I hope you will join us again in the future.